Welcome. It is January 2024, and today I'm going to be talking about the repressed memories epidemic and specifically a podcast that I listened to this week. I binged this incredible podcast called The Memory Hole by Jenna Martin, and it's a look back at the repressed memories epidemic in the 80s and 90s from the perspective of a bystander. Now, Jenna personally never believed she had recovered repressed memories or anything like that, but she was in close proximity with many who had. And as you'll hear, this idea was deeply embedded in the culture at the time. I'm going to talk about this podcast today, but I cannot recommend enough that you go and listen for yourself. It's so good. And frankly, I do think it's incredible that a lot of people don't know about this fascinating and dark period in recent history. Repressed memories are also a perfect historical lesson to help us think about a really thought-provoking question that I received from a parent in my membership group. Now, if you're watching this, then you almost certainly will know what this parent is referring to, but just in case, this mom is asking a question about the hundreds and actually thousands of teens and young adults who adamantly claim to be trans, to be a different sex, or to have been born in the wrong body, and not making this claim from early in their childhood, but actually for the first time in their teen and adult years, and the way that this whole thing seems to really take over their lives. So this mom says, many in our circle commonly say that if it wasn't for the prospect of medicalization, it wouldn't be such a big deal that my child is questioning their identity. Now, I think about this a lot. I'm pretty confident that my daughter is not interested in medicalization now, but this still seems like a very big deal to me. I've come to the conclusion that I have a problem with this because she believes something about herself that isn't true. If she believed other things about herself that weren't true, I think I'd have similar concerns. Like if she believed herself unworthy of love and therefore got into terrible relationships, I'd be concerned. If she believed she was invincible and therefore engaged in a lot of risky behavior, I'd be concerned. I think I have a really hard time with this truth aspect. And I have a feeling that that's part of what causes heartache in so many other parents too. But of course, the naysayers would say, well, this is her truth or their truth. Now, this word true, this inner truth, the true self, it's weird because there are some things that are objectively true, but then the words true and truth are also used to talk about intangible and subjective truths. Now, I really love this question. To me, this is a question about the narrative that her daughter has been telling herself, a narrative that is not objectively true. And so this begs the question, is it dangerous to believe a false story about yourself? As I reflected more on this question, something else strikes me. Believing that you're unworthy of love or invincible and then subsequently engaging in behaviors which are maybe not the best, those kinds of beliefs are actually of a qualitative and subjective nature. Frankly, they are not uncommon beliefs that many of us hold about ourselves when we're young, when we go through something difficult, or when we just have had an experience that shatters our confidence. But they're not claims about objective, tangible reality. I suspect that what this mom is circling around here is that her daughter's claim to not be a girl or to be a boy is a material claim, one that is objectively false. It's very frustrating to watch a child adopt a false belief of this nature, of a material, objective nature. Now, I'll say more about this later, but for now, let's just keep those ideas in our back pocket and move on to the rest of this video. Today, I'm going to tell you about the first 3 episodes of the Memory Hole podcast, and then I'll talk about episodes 4, 5, and 6 next month for our February video. We'll use the repressed memories epidemic to draw parallels with today's surge of young people who are mostly girls coming to believe that they were born in the wrong body, that they're transgender, and that they need to transition to heal their dysphoria. Now, of course, I want to make a disclaimer. Today's video covers topics which are very difficult and sensitive and not suitable for kids, so please be mindful of how and where you watch the rest of this video. All right, so in episode 1 of The Memory Hole, Jenna Martin lays out the cultural zeitgeist of the 80s and 90s. We revisit things like Calvin Klein ads, musical trends, and of course, the cultural focus on incest, which I personally remember hearing a lot about when I was a kid alone in my grandmother's basement watching a lot of daytime TV, which I probably shouldn't have been watching. But she tells us about her college roommates, both of whom at the time were in group therapy with a clinician named Phyllis, meant to help them extract their repressed memories. Phyllis believed that nearly everyone had been abused as a child, but that most people had forgotten about it. Now, by the way, this is not at all how memory works, and we're going to look at this more closely in the February video. So one day, Jenna walks into the living room and she wants to tell her roommate something, but she forgets, slips her mind. She can't remember what she wanted to say. And she describes laughing it off, but her two roommates looked really concerned. They say, Phyllis says that forgetting is a sign of abuse. Jenna explains in the podcast that a part of her actually wished that she could recover abuse memories because she thought a childhood trauma would explain so much about her difficulties and her problems. She also said that wanting to remember was really trendy, with women looking back into their childhoods and kind of reshaping vague fragments of a memory into a really horrific narrative. She explains that certainties can feel more comfortable than vague uncertainties, even if those certainties are really awful. Furthermore, all the certainties that these young women came to believe about themselves couldn't be corroborated by family members or by evidence. Her roommates at the time were encouraging Jenna to do the work, which meant journaling and trying to bypass the conscious mind so that she could recover these hidden memories. They told her that even if you can't remember, that could actually be proof that she had indeed hid the memory or repressed it, or at least that's what Phyllis had taught them. Now, her roommates also believed that their coming together was not a coincidence, but that they had found each other as survivors there to uncover their abuse memories. Now, Jenna describes that moment in the living room when her roommates suggested this. It didn't really sit right with her. And so the podcast is kind of her effort to look back and try to understand how so many people, including herself for some time, believed that horrific abuse memories could in fact be completely repressed and then excavated and used for the purpose of supposedly healing your trauma. Now, Jenna also talks at length throughout the podcast with Meredith Moran, which is a feminist and a writer and a lesbian herself who became convinced that she had been sexually abused by her father and then later realized that that was not true. Now, this is really interesting, and I would encourage you to also check out Meredith Moran's book. And she notes that in the 80s, there were many high-profile cases in the news. This was being talked about all the time on talk shows, daytime TV, and celebrities were even sharing their very real stories of child abuse. There were group therapy sessions, there were documentaries, in-depth investigation stories. But remember, these were cases where victims remembered actual abuse and they remembered it from the day it happened. So these early stories had no repression involved at all. So the next question we need to ask is, how did we go from giving voice to actual real abuse survivors to the theory of repressed memories? So before we can explore how Jenna answers that in episode 2, I want to start by pointing out some of the parallels between repressed memories and transidentification that we can see so far. First of all, the peer-to-peer element is really stark. Jenna talks about how badly people wanted to remember and uncover memories, and they wanted to talk about it with each other almost incessantly. Her roommates were in a therapy group, of course, dedicated to precisely this. And many young people claiming a trans identity kind of have their light bulb moment, or what I call a vector moment, in the context of a peer group. Sometimes these are online groups, sometimes they're groups at school, and sometimes becoming friends with a trans-identified peer kind of develops this infatuation and a close connection, and even maybe if they're dating, this can be the initial point of questioning for a young person. Unfortunately, I've even heard from lots of families that the therapist was the first person to suggest that their child may be trans. Now, especially in the context of a close and intimate connection, like a best friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a therapist, this can really plant a seed in the young person's mind. And oftentimes we see they become quite obsessed with ruminating about and thinking about that seed. Now, I want you to notice something. Journaling and writing plays a really important role. So, we're going to talk more about this later in the context of exploring. But I want you to just take note about the role that narrative creation and stories play, especially rewriting your history that exist in both of these epidemics. Now, to Jenna's roommate, it seemed very serendipitous that they found each other, right? And similarly, gender questioning teens feel the same way. It's like, wow, you're questioning your identity too now, or you've discovered that you're trans as well. Amazing. And of course, the conclusion that they draw, which is a bit of a confirmation bias, is like birds of a feather, like we found each other because we're all trans. Now, of course, another way to interpret that is, did these new ideas about gender become socially transmitted from you to your friend? Now, I have gone into this in a great deal of depth in a recent video on identity formation, so I will include that link below so you can check it out. Now, we don't want to forget about Phyllis, the therapist. Now, this is the kind of therapist who I'd call a true believer. This is similar to some of the gender clinicians who really believe that kids should dig deep, experiment with gender, explore their identity, and potentially come to believe that their gender identity doesn't align with their birth sex. These are the types of clinicians who interpret the smallest, minute thing as a gendered communication. At this point, at least in my world, it's a very well-known clip of Dr. Diane Arensaf, who is a developmental psychologist in California, one of the pioneers of the concept of the trans kid. She's describing a baby ripping a barrette out of her hair or opening up a onesie, and she calls that a gendered communication. So these are really true believers that there's something hidden and internal that is going to show itself through these signs, which of course arguably are just very normal, ubiquitous experiences for all people. We're going to explore how this concept of repressed memories became widespread in the therapeutic community as we dig deeper into episode 2 now. So in episode 2 of The Memory Hole, Jenna Martin starts off by explaining how big a topic incest became in the 80s. Now, real child sexual abuse had been ignored, covered up, dismissed, and not believed for so long. And feminists led the charge rightly in trying to give a voice to survivors and really creating a movement. It was a kind of political resistance movement to combat the silencing of victims and the tendency to overprotect the perpetrators. So daytime TV was covering incest a lot. The podcast features several clips from talk shows and celebrities talking about their own experiences of abuse. And some research at the time was showing that rather than child sexual abuse being this very, very rare thing, which it had been thought of previously, it was actually much more common than people knew. Meredith Moran, the author I talked about earlier, who later retracted accusations of abuse against her father, talked about how she started off just as a kind of concerned bystander. She got involved more with activism, trying to advocate on behalf of survivors. And as she got more involved, it became an all-encompassing cause that really began to color the way she saw everything. She even says at one point that every woman's tear seemed like an incest-driven tear. Now, it's important to point out that those who were coming forward as survivors at this stage had full recollections of their abuse. So nothing had been forgotten, nothing was being recovered, quote unquote. In fact, these were very painful and disturbing memories of abuse that had always been present since the instance. But many women had also kept this abuse a secret for a long time, sometimes for decades. So they consciously chose not to say anything for lots of reasons, including shame, fear of not being believed, etc. So it looked hidden. And just before this time, jokes about the sexual abuse of children were not uncommon. There were also widely accepted allusions to kind of childhood sexualization in books and stories that weren't really critiqued or challenged. She even quotes John Hopkins's John Money, who we know played a huge role in the development of transgender medicine as we know it today, claiming that children having sexual contact with a family member wasn't necessarily an adverse experience. There were some other professionals at the time who even said it could be beneficial and said that kids have the right to sexually express themselves even with a family member. So you can see that the mainstream was finally becoming alarmed about child sexual abuse and framing it as a bad thing that should not happen. Now, by the late 80s, therapists in Boston and Berkeley, California, also the birthplaces of the trans kids movement in the US, began looking closely at the psychological impact on survivors. So they realized that people who were abused in their childhood may have certain issues like body image, self esteem, relationship issues, depression, and others. But if you have those issues, they thought, maybe you can work backwards and assume that you were an incest survivor and that you repressed the memories of it. Now, this is really huge. This is a total inversion and a complete logical fallacy. And this fallacy was the basis of one of the most widely read self-help books of all time. In 1988, The Courage to Heal was written by Ellen Bass and Laura Davis. Bass was a poet and a creative writing instructor, and Davis was her student. Its subtitle was A Guide for Women Survivors of Sexual Abuse. And Bass and David wrote this book to popularize feminist theories about the impact of child sexual abuse. Let's pull out some more parallels based on what we've talked about so far, and then we'll come back to the book in greater depth in episode 3. Cultural shifts are really important, as we saw in episode 2 of the podcast. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on any of these here, but I'm just going to outline a couple that stood out to me. First of all, the emergence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a descriptive term coined by Dr. Lisa Littman, who's a researcher who studied this in 2018. Now, ROGD kids who declare a trans identity for the first time in adolescence, they started to rise in number in the mid-2010s. Now, I think it's important to note that this is a generation of teens who were the first ones to grow up with social media and cell phones during their early puberties. The use of cell phones also corresponds with an increase in mental health issues among teens. Now, the research on this is fuzzy, and I suspect some of this is genuinely elevated levels of distress. And I also think some of this may be self-diagnosis with the increased focus on mental health and the way online accounts can emphasize things like labels, language, and putting your diagnoses in your bio and your pronouns in your bio. So that's the way social media and technology may have an impact on this. I did an in-depth video about this, which I'll include in the notes. Another cultural shift began in 2008 when states were legalizing gay marriage. And by 2015, gay marriage was federally legalized when the US Supreme Court struck down any state bans that existed. Advocacy groups that had largely been devoted to gay marriage rights up until that point now turned their attention to other ways to fight the patriarchy and fight heteronormativity. And they found such a cause with the expanding definition of trans rights. Now, trans rights has evolved not so much to be about employment or housing or equal treatment under the law, but actually these groups began challenging our very concepts of sex, biology, identity, and self-definition. There are some additional legislative changes to the definition of Title IX, which are also really important, and for more on that, I would suggest Lior Sapir's writings. Just as we saw more awareness about incest survivors in the 80s and 90s, today, we have much more visibility for transgender people, and there's a kind of glorifying of affirmation and how important it is to take someone's word at face value. Now, Caitlyn Jenner, formerly the Olympian Bruce Jenner, came out as trans in 2015 and was soon on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine. This felt like a pivotal moment, and this was the first of dozens of high-profile, celebrated trans people who not only came out with their new identities, but whom we were also unable to even speak about who they were pre-transition. The way that journalists and the media seemed to memory hole or kind of erase the previous identities of these people sent a really powerful message that you could totally transform yourself, become a new person, and erase your history. A new narrative was also being put forward to help onlookers understand their distress with their body and with biological sex. Now, this is called a symptom pool, which we can talk a little bit more about in the next video in February. I also want to touch on the Me Too movement. In the late aughts and early 2010s, this movement revealed that many previously hidden, egregious examples of people, mostly men, were abusing their power and getting away with it for years. So when survivors of workplace sexual harassment and coercion started speaking out, we saw a similar phenomenon to what happened with incest survivors. Believe all women was a reaction to the secrecy and the hiding that became a painful reality for so many women. But it also perfectly paved the way for believe trans kids. Taking a victim narrative at face value became the only way to understand a person's claim that they had been abused or that they were marginalized. I know this was not an exhaustive list, but I've covered many of these parallels and others in previous topic videos. So for now, let's jump into episode 3. In the third episode of the Memory Hole podcast, Jenna Martin takes a close look at the courage to heal. She starts off by saying that the book's authors, Ellen Bass and Laura Davis, seem genuinely well-intended and are actually quite likable. They say that thousands of women have been helped by their book. And in fact, it's easy to find lots of enthusiastic praise and gratitude for the courage to heal. Bass and Davis also saw this book as part of a larger feminist struggle. But as I said before, the book was based on a seriously flawed inversion of the facts that can't be corroborated by any scientific evidence. And arguably, its message was far from harmless. Let's start with a clip from Jenna's podcast where she reads a series of questions from the book that are meant to help readers figure out if they've been abused.
Do you feel that you're bad, dirty, or ashamed? Do you feel powerless, like a victim? Do you feel different from other people? Do you feel there's something wrong with you deep down inside, that if people really knew you, they'd leave? Do you ever feel self-destructive or suicidal, or that you simply want to die? Do you hate yourself? Do you have a hard time nurturing and taking care of yourself? Are you able to enjoy feeling good? Do you find it hard to trust your intuition? These questions come from the opening section of The Courage to Heal in a chapter called Taking Stock, where the reader is meant to assess just what is wrong with them. Do you have trouble feeling motivated? Are you often immobilized? Are you afraid to succeed? Can you accomplish things you set out to do? Do you feel you have to be perfect? Do you use work or achievement to compensate for inadequate feelings in other parts of your life? Can you recognize your feelings? The questions in the opening chapters were probably familiar for women, reared as we all were on women's magazines that routinely peppered readers with inane personality quizzes in order to assess our condition. Pop psychology met feminism long before this book, after all. We were used to the crossover between feminism and self-help. Are you prone to depression? But these questions in The Courage to Heal were also not like the questions from women's magazines. The question format feels normal and almost expected in a self-help setting, but the questions are intense, probing, and intrusive. They seem all-knowing about any and all dark thoughts the reader may have had, or discomfort she may have felt.
The book's authors go on to make it clear. It's not your job to figure out if you've been abused, but how the abuse affects you. They insist that you probably have been abused whether you remember it or not. In a chapter called Believing It Happened, they encourage the reader to believe first so that the healing can begin. To believe even if your family says that nothing happened, even if you think you made it up, or if the memories seem too mild or too extreme. You have to come to terms with this. Now, I know how surprising this sounds, but Meredith Moran pointed out in the episode, as someone fighting the patriarchy and as a lesbian, she was used to looking under the cover of American life and finding dark, ugly things that happened and exposing dark truths. And again, there's truth and validity to that. But she was primed to believe things even if they weren't true. The book encourages readers to admit, accept, And if in doubt, they suggest, why don't you just act as though you have been abused and see how that feels? Now, journal writing was the main tool suggested by the book. And as Martin points out, it's simple, expressive, and inexpensive. And apparently it works very well. The authors of the book state that nobody they talked to who suspected she might have been abused later came to discover that she hadn't been. They say it only goes in the other direction, from suspicion to confirmation. They go on to say, if you think you've been abused and your life shows the symptoms, then you were. This is amazing, and I feel like I could stop here, but we'll keep going. When we learn more about memory science in the next video, we're also going to learn about just how powerful narrative and stories are in shaping our memories and shaping our current understanding of ourselves. And spoiler alert, that's not how it should be done. Because stories that we construct are not necessarily harmless. If they drive us away from important people in our lives, if they confuse our sense of direction and spiral us into a mental health crisis. The book promised that recovering these memories of incest could actually completely heal you in your future. But in fact, they destroyed the mental health and lives of thousands. This was actually referred to by a critic of the book as what's called the emergency stage. He describes that a person uncovering these repressed memories begins to not know who they are anymore. They can't sleep, they can't eat, they can't function in their relationships. And sadly, some of these women even attempted suicide, and some succeeded. You might be wondering, if these books' authors were just creative writers and not therapists, why didn't therapists step in and correct the record? Or at least people with some psychological training who know how memories and narratives work? Well, I'll be the first to say therapists are just as susceptible to being swept up in a kind of social contagion. And as we'll hear next month, this phenomena actually came to be called the memory wars. So indeed, there were a lot of therapists objecting and trying to cite evidence, but other therapists really believed in the damage narrative, that there must be some explanation for people's difficulties, and some of the psychoanalytic concepts that date back to Freud, namely repression, were being recycled in a contemporary way. And lots of therapists were on board with this. Plus, let's remember that real child sex abuse was not just coming into public consciousness, but that therapists felt it was their duty to give voice to the previously voiceless. Many therapists began prompting patients for a history of incest and abuse, and were also suggesting to clients that memories could be repressed and should be recovered. Remember that inversion we talked about earlier. In one moment of the podcast, I believe it was Meredith Moran who said something like, every therapy session became a search for past trauma. In these incest survivor groups, individuals would share their memories, and this would always seem to jolt new repressed memories popping up in the other people in the group. Every member in this kind of group who had a defined goal of recovering the memories was eventually able to do so. So I'm sure you're already noticing a lot of parallels yourself. And for this section, I want to start off by looking at the Planned Parenthood website on a page titled, How Do I Know If I'm Transgender? I'm going to put it up here, and why don't you pause the video and take a look through this list. Let's see if we come up with some of the same parallels. First of all, the initial definition of transgender is both circular and poorly defined. So far this is really vague and doesn't tell us much. If the reader doesn't know if they're trans yet, they encourage you to figure it out through writing and journaling, maybe using a gender workbook, reading narratives of other trans-identified people, and starting to talk about gender identity with friends, family, and teachers. They also suggest joining a group, maybe like Phyllis's Recovered Memory Group, and talking to a therapist who specializes in gender. Lastly, they're told to act as though they are trans and experiment with different names, pronouns, or even changing their body, presumably breast binding, compression garments, or genital tucking for males. They say to try on some makeup or a new outfit. They also reassure you that you're not alone. Camaraderie, understanding, and being part of a community of others who also struggle like you can be deeply reassuring and show you that even by being here and exploring this, you're on the right track. They even encourage you to read about cisnormativity and cissexism. So here too, you can be part of this resistance movement and begin weaving your advocacy and political resistance into your own marginalized group identity. Now, probably one of the most glaring parallels is the way each theory, both repressed memories theory and gender identity theory, reframe totally normal, ubiquitous aspects of being a person into proof that you've either repressed a traumatic memory or that you're trans. I haven't elaborated much on this here, but there are plenty of examples and they're very easy to find. You can try Googling, why do I hate my breasts? Or why am I uncomfortable in my body? You'll most certainly be directed at some point soon to question your identity. Now, I want to come back to how doubts are treated in both of these epidemics. With repressed memories, if you're unsure about having been abused, the doubts themselves could be more proof that you in fact were abused. Now, with trans too, doubts, hesitance, or disbelief are reframed as an indication that you are in fact trans and in denial. I want you to go look up the Reddit posts about being an egg. This is a reference to biological males who now claim to be trans and look back at all of the, quote, denial that they were in about this. It's a reference to having your egg cracked when you come out, that you were hidden in a shell, and now you're not. Similarly, in online communities geared more towards females who believe themselves to be guys, girls reassure each other that they are real guys, even if they don't believe it themselves, even if their hands are too small or they're only 5 feet tall, for example. Eliza Mondegreen is a researcher who has written extensively on the way doubts are treated in these online communities. Spoiler alert, other group members almost always confirm you. Yes, you are trans. Remember the emergency state we just talked about? Most parents of ROGD kids have seen this complete downward spiral in many of their kids. Some parents describe that it's like their child was replaced by a totally different kid. They'll say, she quit all her favorite activities, she threw away her whole wardrobe, and she's descended into emotional darkness, characterized by isolation, coldness, and depression. The rift that occurs between a young person and her family has a different flavor today with trans identity as it did with repressed memories, but of course we can see similarities nonetheless. Now, this is not always the case, but it's happened more often than could be coincidence. Boys can also experience a complete identity crisis with trans identification too. Here's one post from the Egg IRL Reddit thread. It says, I might be trans and I'm afraid to find out. Then, hopefully this article helps me sort my way through. Finding out nearly all of my vices and bad habits root from many forms of dysphoria, meaning gender dysphoria, that I've had for 5 years, destroying my concept of who I am and forcing myself to try and accept myself. So of course, this reminds us of just believe. First step is accepting that this happened to you and a complete dissolution of the person's sense of identity. While I know a lot of these online communities breed a certain type of really extreme rhetoric, this is not far from what professionals in WPATH and other trans advocacy groups will encourage. Remember that gender-affirming care has elements which are explicitly political and encourage doctors and therapists to learn from their patients and to move boldly into a field which aims to redress the marginalization and ostracization of trans-identified people. It's also important to remember that historically, some trans-identified people felt very frustrated by the stringent gatekeeping model that used to take a slower, more cautious approach to medicalization. Now, some people feel that that was a wonderful form of therapy for them, but others, who sometimes have a more prominent voice in the discussion today, feel as though removing barriers to care involves believing what people say at face value. So we can see where believe trans kids came from. People say they know who they are. You shouldn't question somebody else's identity. Another element that is certainly impacting therapists today is that psychoanalytic perspectives have historically demonized homosexuality. And funny enough, many of these are actually derived also from Freud. Though these perspectives feel in the past and somewhat vestigial today, they've been revisited with a new lens of gender identity. We're told that therapists should not psychoanalyze their client's gender identity, like they might have done with someone's sexual orientation in the past. And just as therapists and professionals minimize the harm of incest and sometimes even accused a child of lying, so now the impulse is to believe the client when they tell you who they are and help them come to terms, whether it's with the fact that they had been abused or the fact that they're trans, and integrate this new understanding into their self-concept. Also, anyone who's questioned the idea that memories could be repressed and recovered at the time were accused of siding with sex abusers. This is a very damaging accusation, which of course would make people afraid to talk about what they're seeing. This is no different from currently being accused of transphobia, bigotry, or opposing progress, or worse yet, denying people a human right to gender-affirming care. There's also a huge discrepancy between the people who believe that exploring their trans identity has been life-saving and necessary, and those like detransitioners who think it has ruined their lives. Or the difference between a young person's memory of their childhood and their parents' memory of their childhood. The discrepancy between these two accounts can be glaring. And lastly, maybe most importantly, these were both theories that were perhaps applicable to a very small percentage of the population that became expanded and applied to people for whom they were not appropriate. Yes, child sexual abuse survivors have this list of symptoms, but just because somebody has those symptoms, it doesn't mean they're an abuse survivor. And this is where we come back to the original question posed by the mom about objective truth, material claims, etc. People with gender dysphoria who develop those feelings of incongruence from a very young age or without prompting or without suggestion have existed for some time. But does that mean we should necessarily prompt all young people to start questioning their gender for the first time in adolescence or in their childhood classrooms or in the context of peer groups? And when it comes to repressed memories, the narratives that were being constructed in the context of these therapy groups and reading these books and ruminating about your memories, they were making material claims about a moment in history, about something that they claimed had actually happened to them in real life. That is a kind of material claim. And what we see with trans-identified kids can kind of fall into two sorts of claims. We have some kids who claim, I'm not actually a girl, or I'm literally a boy, and I've always been a boy. That is a kind of material claim, which is possible to refute with facts and evidence and science. Now, of course, we know that some trans advocates and advocacy groups are trying to blur the line between male and female. But there's another kind of claim being made by a lot of rapid onset gender dysphoric kids or trans-identified young adults, which is that I'm trans. And that word actually is very subjective. My internal sense of identity doesn't match my biological sex. So in this type of definition or claim, there's still an acknowledgement of biological sex. So the young person is making a subjective claim about their inner feelings. What's so interesting about this is that we know memory construction is actually very subjective. We're going to talk more about this in our next video, but I just wanted to leave us there with this question, because reconstructing the past and making a claim about something that actually happened is interesting when compared to reconstructing your past and making a claim about your subjective experience. Now, I know that this is a lot to think about, and I imagine some people will strongly object to me making these things parallel. But anybody who's been observing this phenomenon closely will see that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the repressed memories epidemic. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will see you in February for more about the Memory Hole podcast, which of course I will be sure to link below so that you can listen in. See you then.